trash piled high in Leicester Square, spilling from black bin bags left uncollected as rubbish strikes swept the nation. The smell of rot lingered in the air while, across the country, factories closed their gates and men and women gathered on picket lines, demanding better pay in the midst of spiraling inflation. Police patrolled city streets as far-right groups marched, stoking racial tensions in neighborhoods already strained by poverty and uncertainty. In the background, dole queues grew longer, with official unemployment figures rising throughout the early 1970s and surpassing 1 million by April 1975, a generation of young people facing the sharp end of industrial decline, their futures more uncertain than at any time since the war. This was Britain in the 1970s, a landscape that John Lydon, later known as Johnny Rotten of the Sex Pistols, remembered as very depressing. He described a nation marked by total unemployment, with rubbish in the streets and an air of futility. In this climate, optimism was scarce. The country faced not just economic hardship, but a crisis of confidence, a sense that the social contract that had held since the Second World War was unraveling. The post-war consensus, which had promised security, welfare, and steady work, was dissolving. Inflation soared to nearly 25%, the misery index reached new heights, and government after government struggled to keep the economy afloat. By 1976, Britain was forced to seek a bailout from the International Monetary Fund, a moment that symbolized the nation's fall from its former economic might. Meanwhile, the music scene reflected these divisions and anxieties. The late 1960s and early 1970s saw the rise of skinheads and glam rockers, distinct subcultures that both mirrored and shaped working-class youth culture. Skinheads, drawing on Jamaican ska and reggae, adopted elements of black style in music, while glam rockers, with their androgynous costumes and theatrical flair, used fashion and performance to shock and provoke. These groups expressed both pride and rebellion, but the social context was shifting. Economic instability, aggravated by the organization of the petroleum exporting country's oil crisis and rising unemployment over 1 million, by April 1975 brought the post-war boom to an abrupt end. The working-class optimism that had defined earlier decades faded, replaced by a darker, more uncertain mood. For many young people, the future seemed to have disappeared. Job prospects shrank as manufacturing declined and public sector employment was cut back. The economic conditions facing the youth were particularly stark as the shift away from Keynesian policies took hold. The opportunities that had once been available to school leavers all but vanished. The result was a generation left to drift, their ambitions thwarted by forces far beyond their control. Social tensions mounted as well. Racial inequality was deeply embedded in British life. Education policies in the 1970s were often overtly racist, with many black children wrongly placed in educationally subnormal schools, a stark symbol of broader discrimination and the barriers to achievement faced by minority communities. At the same time, the rise of the National Front and other far-right groups fueled racial hostility, prompting a response from activists and musicians who would soon form movements like Rock Against Racism, combining music and activism to counteract bigotry. All of this created a tinderbox atmosphere, a sense that something had to give. The music industry, for its part, seemed increasingly out of touch. Mainstream rock had become overproduced and distant from the realities of everyday life. The industry's focus on polished commercial acts left little room for the anger and alienation many young people felt. Yet beneath the surface, a new sensibility was taking root, a rejection of the status quo, a hunger for something raw and real. It was in this context that punk exploded onto the scene. In 1976, British punk began to coalesce around the Sex Pistols, a band that embodied the chaos and fury of the age. Their music, stripped down and aggressive, was a deliberate rejection of what had come before. Songs like Anarchy in the UK and God Save the Queen distilled the prevailing mood of disaffection, memorably declaring no future for a generation that felt forgotten. The Sex Pistols' manager, Malcolm McLaren, and fashion designer Vivienne Westwood gave punk a visual language to match its sound. Their designs, ripped clothes, safety pins, anti-materialist slogans rejected the excess of mainstream fashion. Janie Reed's collage-style artwork for the Sex Pistols, with its ransom note lettering and defaced royal imagery, visually captured the anger and disillusionment that defined the era. Punk's emergence was not just a musical event, it was a total cultural upheaval. The movement injected politics into youth culture in a way that was both direct and confrontational. DIY culture became central as young people produced their own fanzines, set up independent labels, and built an alternative media ecosystem. Punk's rejection of polished production and commercialism resonated with those who saw traditional institutions, whether in music, government, or society, as corrupt or irrelevant. The music was loud and fast, the lyrics confrontational, but Punk's impact extended far beyond sound. It was a way of being, a challenge to social and cultural authority. Beyond the Sex Pistols, bands like The Clash would take Punk's raw energy and channel it into overt political commentary. While the research context does not elaborate on The Clash's particular contributions in this chapter, it is clear that Punk overall politicized youth culture and provoked what contemporaries described as a moral panic. Authorities, the press, and older generations saw in Punk a threat to the social order. Yet for the young, it was liberation, a chance to create meaning in a world that seemed to have lost its way. Punk's fashion, shaped by figures like Westwood and McLaren, was as much a critique of consumerism and social complacency as the music itself. The look was anti-materialistic, celebrating imperfection and the handmade. By rejecting the polished and the expensive, punk fashion became its own form of protest, a way to visually declare independence from societal norms and expectations. This DIY spirit extended into every aspect of punk life, from self-produced zines to homemade band merchandise, reinforcing the sense of community and rebellion. The late 1970s, then, were marked by extremes, economic turmoil, political crisis, and social division. Industrial decline, record strikes, and the grim realities of everyday life created a sense of national malaise that permeated everything. The rise of neoliberal economic policies signaled the end of an era and the uncertain beginning of another. In this environment, punk was not just a soundtrack, but a statement, a refusal to accept defeat, a demand to be heard. Historians generally agree that punk's arrival marked a defining moment in British cultural history. It was a movement born not in affluence or contentment, but in frustration and anger. The Sex Pistols, with their confrontational lyrics and chaotic performances, became the focal point of this revolution. Their songs captured the spirit of a generation left behind by economic change and political drift. The punk explosion of 1977 would ripple outward, reshaping not only music but also fashion, art, and activism, leaving a mark on British society that endures to this day. Looking back, the conditions that set the stage for punk's emergence were as complex as they were bleak. If the streets of 1970s Britain seemed littered with rubbish and broken promises, they were also alive with possibility, a raw, defiant energy that would soon ignite the punk revolution. It began with two teenagers skipping school. Steve Jones and Paul Cook, restless and searching for an escape from the drabness around them, formed the core of what would soon become a cultural earthquake. By 1975, they were joined by Glenn Matlock and, soon after, John Lydon, who would become Johnny Rotten, a name that would haunt the nightmares of polite society. Together, this group became the Sex Pistols, and with them, punk in Britain exploded into being. Their first show in November of that year marked the start of a story that would burn bright and fast, leaving a mark on music and culture that has never truly faded. The Sex Pistols were more than a band, they were a provocation. Guided by their manager Malcolm McLaren, whose instincts for controversy were as sharp as a razor blade, the Pistols embraced chaos. McLaren, along with designer Vivienne Westwood, crafted a look as confrontational as the music: ripped shirts, spiky hair, slogans scrawled across chests, and safety pins jabbed through flesh and fabric alike. Johnny Rotten's infamous "I Hate Pink Floyd" shirt was only the beginning. These were not just clothes, they were statements, each one a middle finger raised to the establishment, a declaration that the old rules no longer applied. Their sound was immediate and raw. Where mainstream rock had grown polished and distant, the Sex Pistols slashed through the air with snarling guitars and thunderous drums. Their music was protest made audible, every chord and chorus a rejection of the status quo. Their first single, Anarchy in the UK, released after signing with EMI in 1976, was less a song than a manifesto, loud, urgent, and impossible to ignore. But it was on stage that the Pistols' power was undeniable. After their first show in November 1975, their most infamous gigs occurred in 1976 and 1977, not just for their volume, but for the sheer sense of danger that hung in the air. Everyone who saw them seemed to walk away changed. At Manchester's Lesser Free Trade Hall in June 1976, a handful of spectators would later form bands of their own: Joy Division, Buzzcocks, and others, each inspired by the Pistols' ferocity and their refusal to play by anyone's rules. Controversy followed the Pistols like a shadow. In December 1976, they appeared on the Bill Grundy television show. What was meant to be a brief, late-afternoon interview instead became a national scandal. Goaded by Grundy, the band swore live on air, and within hours they were front-page news. The phone lines at Thames Television burned with complaints, and moral outrage erupted across the country. Suddenly, punk was not a rumor or a whispered threat. It was everywhere, its sneer and swagger impossible to ignore. The Sex Pistols found themselves banned from venues, their very presence deemed too dangerous for polite company. Yet, as often happens, every attempt to silence them only made their message louder. The Pistols' story was also one of internal friction, the kind that seems almost inevitable when so much energy is packed into so fragile a vessel. Glenn Matlock, a founding member, was replaced in early 1977 by Sid Vicious, a figure whose name would become synonymous with punk itself. Sid brought with him a wildness that matched the band's image, but also, as history would show, an instability that would ultimately contribute to their undoing. In 1977, as the nation celebrated the Queen's Silver Jubilee, the Sex Pistols released God Save the Queen. It was a masterstroke of provocation, its lyrics openly attacking the monarchy and the establishment. The BBC swiftly banned it, and the record became the most censored in British history. Yet, even as it was kept from the airwaves, it soared in popularity, its absence from the charts as conspicuous as its presence in the streets and the minds of the disaffected. The single did not just challenge the establishment, it laid bare the gulf between those in power and the youth who felt themselves left behind. For many, God Save the Queen was not just a song. It was a rallying cry, an anthem for a generation that had been told to keep quiet and carry on. The Sex Pistols, however, were never built to last. Their sole studio album, Nevermind the Bollocks, Here Is the Sex Pistols, released in 1977, was a distillation of everything the band stood for. It shot to #1 in the United Kingdom, despite, or perhaps because of, its controversial title and explicit content. Critics and fans alike recognized it as a defining statement, a collection of protest rhetoric put to music. Every track bristled with the ideas, beliefs, and values that had come to define punk, disillusionment, anger, and a refusal to accept things as they were. The band's do-it-yourself approach, from their music to their attitude, was not just a style but a philosophy. They showed young people that you did not need permission to create, that the tools of rebelling were already in your hands. Yet, as 1978 dawned, the Pistols' trajectory began to falter. Internal tensions grew, and the chaos that had fueled their rise now threatened to tear them apart. The United States tour, meant to break them in America, became a catalog of mishaps and confrontations. Sid Vicious's behavior grew ever more erratic, and the band finally imploded in January. Sid Vicious died in 1979, a casualty of the very nihilism he had come to symbolize. For some, the Sex Pistols were a manufactured outrage, a cynical creation of McLaren's clever marketing. The film, The Great Rock and Roll Swindle, would later stoke these debates, suggesting that the band's influence was as much about manipulation as music. But whatever the truth of their origins, few would deny the Pistols' impact. They ignited a movement, transforming not just music but the very fabric of youth culture. Their influence is visible in the countless bands and artists who followed, in the post-punk and alternative scenes that flourished in their wake. The Pistols' shock value was never just for its own sake. Their antics, whether swearing on television or sneering at royalty, embodied a deeper sense of alienation and anger. They gave voice to the frustrations of a generation left behind by economic decline and political indifference. Their music and image, shaped as much by Westwood and McLaren as by the band members themselves, became the blueprint for punk fashion, a radical departure from norms, a celebration of do-it-yourself embellishment and anti-establishment statements. Johnny Rotten and Sid Vicious, in particular, became style icons, their looks copied and adapted around the world. Even after their breakup, the Sex Pistols' legacy endured. They remained one of the most iconic and influential punk bands in history, their brief career a testament to the power of music to provoke, inspire, and unsettle. Modern audiences continue to discover and debate their music, their legacy, and their authenticity. The Pistols were the spark that set the punk scene ablaze and, in doing so, changed the course of popular culture forever. While the Sex Pistols were often seen as the initial explosion, it was the Clash who would go on to define British punk's next chapter. Yet, it was the Pistols' noise, their scandal, and their sound that made it all possible. In every band that followed, in every act of rebellion and creation, echoes of the Sex Pistols can still be heard, raw, uncompromising, and utterly unforgettable. Their lyrics never held back. From the beginning, the Clash targeted the forces of capitalism and consumer culture, which they saw as engines of alienation and conformity. Songs like Career Opportunities and, later in their discography, Lost in the Supermarket, were more than anthems for the disillusioned. They were miniature manifestos using wit and sharp imagery to dissect the emptiness at the heart of modern life. The supermarket became a maze of branding and false promises, while the world of work was exposed as a dead end, crushing youthful dreams beneath the weight of routine and resignation. Their critique of materialism was always grounded in the lived reality of their audience, the grinding monotony and limited prospects that defined the era for so many. Punk rock, born amid the turbulence of the 1970s, possesses a peculiar power. Its aftershocks continue to ripple through music, fashion, art, and even activism long after the original tremors faded. When the Sex Pistols and the Clash first exploded onto the scene, few could have predicted just how far-reaching their influence would become. Yet, decades later, the energy and defiance they ignited refused to be confined to a single era or geography. Instead, the punk revolution persists, its spirit revived by new generations who find in its messy audacity a toolkit for challenging the status quo. The legacy of the Sex Pistols is especially striking for its paradoxes. Their time together was brief, their implosion as sudden as their rise, but the impact of their raw sound and anti-establishment fury endured. In the years that followed, countless musicians drew inspiration from the Pistols' template, stripped-down music, sneering attitude, and a belief that anyone could pick up a guitar and play. This do-it-yourself, or DIY, ethos shattered the old rules of the music industry. Suddenly, the gatekeepers were less relevant. Small, independent labels and grassroots communities sprang up in the Pistols' wake, fueled by the idea that authenticity mattered more than polish or pedigree. Even now, in the 21st century, this spirit remains alive as modern punk bands harness digital technology to record, release, and promote their music without waiting for corporate approval. The same irreverence that once shocked polite society now powers a global network of independent artists, each a living echo of the original punk eruption. But the Sex Pistols' influence was never limited to music alone. Their look clothes torn and reassembled, safety pins and slogans became a visual shorthand for rebellion. This punk fashion, radical in its critique of consumerism and embrace of imperfection, has left an indelible mark on style. Designers around the world have borrowed, adapted, and reinterpreted punk's aesthetic, smuggling its spirit of individuality and resistance into the mainstream. Even as trends come and go, the traces of punk are unmistakable in ripped fabrics, bold graphics, and a certain deliberate carelessness. For many, the very idea of self-expression through clothing, a refusal to blend in, a willingness to provoke, can be traced to the example set by the Pistols and their contemporaries. Punk's fashion legacy is not just visible on runways or in boutiques, it is woven into the broader cultural understanding that what you wear can be a statement of defiance. If the Sex Pistols were the spark, the Clash were the wildfire spreading punk's reach, expanding its vocabulary and demonstrating its capacity for both confrontation and sophistication. The Clash took the raw materials of punk and, through sheer ambition, made something far greater than the sum of its parts. They showed that punk could be politically aware and musically adventurous, that it could blend genres and ideas without losing its edge. Their willingness to experiment, bringing in reggae, funk, and other influences, helped broaden the genre's appeal, drawing in listeners who might otherwise have dismissed punk as a passing fad. In doing so, the Clash offered a blueprint for future generations. Punk was not a closed system, but a starting point for endless reinvention. The rivalry and mutual influence between the Sex Pistols and the Clash shaped the very trajectory of punk. Their competition was not just about who could play faster or shout louder. It was about who could more effectively channel the frustrations and hopes of a generation. This dynamic tension inspired countless bands in their wake, each interpreting punk's core principles in their own way. Some doubled down on the Pistols' nihilistic sneer, while others followed the Clash's example and reached for something more expansive and socially engaged. Together, these bands ensured that punk would never settle into a single sound or message, but remain a living, evolving force. Decades on, the debate between the Sex Pistols and the Clash continues, a kind of cultural mirror reflecting punk's ongoing relevance. Fans and critics alike argue about which band mattered more, which defined the movement, which left the deeper mark. But this very argument is part of punk's legacy, a refusal to accept easy answers, an insistence on questioning orthodoxy even when it comes to its own history. That the idols of 1970s punk still inspire such passionate discussion is evidence of the movement's enduring significance. Punk's influence reaches far beyond the music charts. Its arrival shook the very foundations of the music industry, forcing a reckoning with notions of authenticity, commercialism, and the power of youth culture. by challenging existing norms. Punk opened space for political and moral debate, not just about music, but about society itself. Its anti-establishment attitude forced listeners to confront uncomfortable truths, sparking conversations that continue to resonate in contemporary culture. In the years since, punk's do-it-yourself mindset has become a guiding light for independent artists in every medium. The proliferation of indie labels, zines, and grassroots collectives, whether in music, literature, or visual art, testifies to punk's lingering inspiration. The artistic movement birthed by punk was about more than just sound or style. At its core, it expressed a deep sense of angst and rebellion, a yearning to disrupt, to challenge, to assert the right to exist outside prescribed boundaries. This disruptive mindset has seeped into branding, design, and self-expression, inspiring those who seek authenticity in a world that often values conformity. The messy, anti-commercial aesthetic of punk, from hand-scrawled flyers to cut-and-paste album covers, remains a touchstone for anyone intent on making their own mark, unpolished and unapologetic. Punk's distinct identity, forged in opposition to the mainstream, continues to inform how people approach not only music, but also fashion and personal expression. The movement's emphasis on individuality and its celebration of the imperfect and the handmade have become cultural touchstones for generations. Even as punk's original shock value has faded, its critique of consumerism and embrace of rebellion have lost none of their force. These attitudes are visible in everything from the way people dress to the brands they reject, from the art they make to the communities they build. New generations have not only inherited punk's legacy, they have made it their own. In the 2020s, modern punk bands still channel the activism, diversity, and independence that defined the original movement. Technology has become a new tool in the do-it-yourself arsenal, enabling artists to bypass traditional barriers and connect directly with audiences. This evolution has not diluted punk's core message. If anything, it has allowed that message to reach farther, faster, and with greater urgency. The activism that once fueled protest songs and anti-establishment manifestos now finds expression online as well as on stage, uniting people across continents in shared causes. Punk's entry into public consciousness, crystallized in moments like the Sex Pistols' notorious television appearances, marked a turning point in the relationship between youth culture and society at large. The impact of those early shocks continues to be felt, not as distant echoes, but as living influences, shaping attitudes, inspiring creativity, and fueling resistance. The volatility that saw bands like the Sex Pistols and the Clash burn so brightly and then collapse is part of what makes their legacy so powerful. Their abrupt endings serve as reminders of punk's inherent instability, but also of its capacity to endure in new forms. In the end, the punk revolution did not solve the problems of its time. It did something perhaps more lasting. It taught people how to resist, how to create, how to question, and how to imagine something different. The music, the fashion, the art, and above all the attitude, these are the aftershocks of punk, still rumbling beneath the surface of contemporary life. Whether in the hands of a new band, on the runway of a fashion show, or in the voice of a protester, the influence of the Sex Pistols, the Clash, and the entire punk movement remains unmistakable. Their legacy is not a relic, but a living challenge, a call to keep asking, keep pushing, and never settle for the world as it is.